Hello, everybody. I'm so glad I can join this second lecture of the title, Peaceful Reunification of Korea, Why the Only Way to World Peace. As I mentioned in the first lecture, the topic of world peace is really big and difficult one. But regardless of that, we need to think about how to achieve world peace because it is so essential. In the first lecture, I was focusing on Korea and the Korean Peninsula as a cultural superpower. It is because I think we need not only soft power, but also hard power to achieve the world peace. So I explained Korea as a really essential soft power for the last more than 5 millennia, based on the founding principle of 경천애인, live your heaven and love your people, and 홍익인간, that is benefit the humanity at large. Based on these two founding principles, Korea accepted the four major the human wisdom from the East, Buddhism and Confucianism, and from the West, the Hebraism and Hellenist traditions. So Korea actually blended all these big teachings into one, and now, bring up a Hallyu, a Korean wave. So that has a lot of ramification toward many parts of the world, even especially young people. So that based on that emphasis on soft power, I like to bring up, hard power aspects in the next lectures. This second lecture will focus on peaceful unification and world peace. Now we have a violent division of the Korean Peninsula in 1945, and its aftermath is a international war, devastating war, rather than world peace. So why is the only way? I I think that we need both wings, left wing, leftist, right wing, rightist together. And I thought Korea is kind of a linchpin, linking two wings, two sides. So that's why I think Korean unification is the key aspects in achieving world peace as a linchpin. Okay, now you see the map of Korean Peninsula, and the time is early 20th century. It's a very complicated era. And maybe you know that Japanese imperialism exerts significant influence, especially after Japan won the war against Russia in 1905 and 1904 and 5. And then Korea became under Japanese colonial rule until 1945. And then Japan, as exerted influence over Manchuria, and and the war began in 1941 in the Pacific War with the US. We'll talk about that later. And on the other side of the Korean Peninsula, far in Russia, in St. Petersburg, in 1917, there was a Bolshevik revolution. You may have heard that, based on Marxism and Leninism. So that I thought it is a breakout of the communism virus, spread it so quickly worldwide, even in democratic nations like the US. And especially in China, the most populous country in the world, you know, got this communism virus, and Mao Zedong established Communist Party in 1921 in Shanghai. And prior to that, there's a nationalist forces, formed the party called Chinese Nationalist Party. And two parties, have had a sort of cooperation and civil war because of Japanese aggression during the time. So there was a two period of civil war. There's 1927 to 36 and 1945 to 1949 when communists, won over the nationalists. So all in all, two evils of fascist imperialism and communism virus sort of overlapped in Asia, including Korean Peninsula, and that in 1945, those fascist states in Germany, Italy, and Japan all collapsed. Now, the year 1945, the violent division on the Korean Peninsula, we'll talk about that. So at this time is the end of World War II. There are two major conference kind of meeting by Allied leaders, one in February, the other one in July. The first one in Yalta. This is a resort city in Crimea facing Black Sea. At the time, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill from England and Stalin from the Soviet Union, gathered to discuss how to end the World War II. So at the time, there was also talk about the war in Pacific in Asia. And, actually Roosevelt and Stalin agreed that the Soviet will join the war in Asia. But Stalin was somewhat hesitant at the time because war in Europe has not ended, formally yet. But also there's some health concerns of Roosevelt, I guess, so that there are too many U.S. soldiers' casualties in Asia Pacific War because of so-called Europe First policy between Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. So all the ammunitions and armaments went to Europe first. So that's a lot of casualties of US soldiers in the Pacific War. So that worried, Roosevelt a lot. So that Roosevelt allowed Soviet participating in the Asian War. And you know that in 2 months later, Roosevelt died out of disease in April. And then on May 7, Germany finally surrendered. And around 2 months later in Potsdam, in Germany, the Allied leaders gathered again. At this time, in the US, from the US, it is Harry Truman. Not known well to not just to the US citizens, but also world stage. Harry Truman's appearance is quite sudden. So in Potsdam, it was really, hectic kind of gatherings among Truman and Churchill and Stalin. And as you know, that Churchill during the Potsdam era is replaced by Prime Minister Attlee because of election in England at the time. Anyway, in Potsdam, while waiting for the meeting, Truman was anxiously waiting for the result of atomic bomb test, so that Truman got informed that the atomic bomb test was successful. So Truman felt, good and feel like he's in upper hand in negotiating. But unfortunately, Stalin also got informed about that news through, the communist spies in the US government. That was known through the historical archives. So the meeting was quite complicated. And because Stalin is already spreading communism to, that Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Hungary, so that, Truman was very worried about the spread of communism so that Truman was trying to stop Stalin's kind of involvement in Asia, but Stalin insisting that U.S. should, keep the promise of President Roosevelt about the Soviet participation. But Truman did not give any firm signal about the Soviet joining in the war in Asia. But regardless of that, Stalin has an aspiration to kind of join the division of Japan, just like Germany was divided by four nations, by Allied, U.S. and Soviet Union, and England and France. So, but Truman, clearly rejected the idea of Russia, Soviet Union's occupation of Hokkaido. But as history tells, when the first atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, Stalin firmly decided to join the war in the Pacific and declared a war against Japan 2 days later, August 8th, and immediately annexed the entire Sakhalin Island and 4 Korean islands as a sort of spoils of war. And then the Soviet also, while, disarming Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria, those weapons was, sent to Mao Zedong's CCP army. That was very, interesting, but there was a still cooperation between the two big communists already. And then there is another atomic bomb in Nagasaki, August 9, and then Japan sort of surrendered quickly. So it is expected, but really not expected, kind of total surrender by Japan too quickly. So that, unlike U.S. expectation, the Soviet kind of encroached upon too quickly on the Korean Peninsula. So the next day of August 10th, that the U.S. just notified in a hurried manner not to cross the 38th parallel. Is an action of containing the communism virus because it's so quickly spread in the Korean Peninsula. So it should be mentioned that some revisionist view, some leftist view emphasizing U.S. imperialism in the Korean Peninsula, they said that U.S., just cut the half of the Korean Peninsula, 38th parallel, as the U.S. tried to occupy the Korean Peninsula. But that view is not really warranted as you see the progress of communism spread in the Korean Peninsula and Soviet aspiration in Japan. So I have to make it clear that the division, although it was decided by the middle-ranking U.S. Department officials, but the real cause of division of the Korean Peninsula is the rapid spread of communism by the Soviets too quickly. And then Japan surrendered, and Soviet forces moved in Wonsan, the Rome of the East in the map, and Pyongyang in the Jerusalem of the East. The Soviet forces occupy. And somewhat later, U.S. forces moved in. Actually, U.S. forces thought that this 38th parallel is a temporary line. I don't think U.S. has any intention to occupy, southern half of Korean Peninsula. As you see later, the U.S. troops completely withdraw from the Korean Peninsula in 1949. So throughout the 1945 to 48, And South Korea became more democratic nation. There's around 40,000 U.S. forces moved in, along with the pro-U.S. Seung-ho Lee, who became the president later, and also independent fighters fighting against Japanese forces in China, along with Kuomintang, KMT forces, National Forces of China, in South Korea. And in North Korea, around 25 Soviet forces moved in, along with pro-Soviet Kim Il-sung, and thousands of independence fighters in China, fighting together with Chinese Communists, CCP. So some revisionist view, leftist view, say that Soviet moved in North Korea as a liberator of the Korean people, while in South Korea, U.S. forces moved in as occupying forces. But it's nonsensical. Actually, Soviet forces moved in as a liberator, but is a big wolf clothing with a ship's clothing. You can imagine that. What happened later between 1948 to 1950 and the war. So now we see the onset of two states on the Korean Peninsula. And there's a United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea. The President Truman is a strong believer in the role of United Nations as a protector of world peace. I heard that President Truman served as a soldier during World War I and admired and President Woodrow Wilson and his proposition of a League of Nations after World War I. And he said later, U.S. should have joined the League of Nations. If so, that World War II did not occur. That's his conviction, the Truman's conviction of the United Nations. So that Truman is working very hard to set up democratic nation on the Korean Peninsula. So he set up actually U.S. set up in November 1947 the UN Temporary Commission on Korea to hold a free election in the Korean Peninsula, and they went into Seoul 1948. But unfortunately, and you might imagine, the Soviet Union and North Korea rejected the UNCOC's involvement in North Korean election process. So a lot of, complicated situation in the Korean Peninsula. So after all these, the UNCOC decided hold a election on the southern half. So election was held on May 10th under the auspices of the United Nations. So it is very, very important to note that the South Korea is the only legally recognized state under international law that's still valid. But in North Korea, the DPRK was, set up on September 9th with the support of the Soviet Union. And still the UN commissions trying to persuade the Soviet Union, but failed. So, as I said, because the DPRK denied the UN monitoring and intervention, it is considered illegal state, and I would say it is unlawful detainer in the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. So UN, and after the Korean War, UN command is still remains effective in managing affairs. This is very important point. And the later lectures when I talked about the how to reunify the Korean Peninsula. So in other aspects of it, there's a threat of war is looming. The Truman sort of unfortunately completely withdraw U.S. forces from the South Korea while UN Commission remained in a diplomatic mission. And the Soviets, the shrewd guys retained thousands of military advisors for war planning already, and substantial of war armaments still coming in from Russia, from Moscow to Pyongyang. You know that because of the Soviet spies in the US government, many, surprised that so quickly the Soviet developed nuclear weapons in 1949. And, a few months later, the communist CCP in China defeated the Kuomintang national forces in the Civil War. It's so unfortunate. And President Truman was, very surprised and don't know what to do. And another aspects in DPRK and China relations, after the founding of DPRK in 1945, at least two formal divisions of DPRK soldiers and troops joined civil war in China and helped the Mao Zedong to win over Kuomintang forces, the national forces, and came back to Pyongyang. And Kim Il Sung undoubtedly aspired similar civil war on the Korean Peninsula. With this, very well trained soldiers of two divisions, more than 30,000 soldiers, along with the Soviet army. And in the diplomatic side, unfortunately, there was a so-called Atchison Line speech by Truman and Dean Acheson that exclude, South Korea and Taiwan. The speech's main emphasis on Japanese security, and the defense line cut across Aleutians, Japan, Ryukyus, and Philippines. So here, in the actual speech, so far as the military security of other areas in the Pacific is concerned, it must be clear that no person can guarantee these areas against military attack. So this speech was obviously miscalculated and misinterpreted by Kim Il-sung, Stalin, and Mao. And I think it's played a major role in the final decision among these three, people, Kim Il-sung and Stalin and Mao, as a communist brothers. So big brother Stalin, 72 years old at the time, Mao, 57, Kim Il-sung is 38 years old. There are a lot of communication letters and all sort of visits among them, and decided to attack South Korea on June 5th. At the time, the Truman was on vacation in his hometown, Missouri. And then he was kind of informed in the late evening that he immediately reacted to the news of North Korean invasion. And there was an overnight operation in the United Nations that Truman ordered the UN members kind of join the meeting throughout the night. That was a really, hectic moment, important moment, because Truman is a strong believer in the United Nations, and that attack against South Korea is considered as an attack against the United Nations scheme that Truman really, want to hold it. So all in all, aftermath of the 38th Parallel Division in 1945 is Korean War in 1950. So I don't want to go details in the Korean War, but I want to focus on four aspects of the Korean War. The first one is this is the ideological war. The first ideological war alongside the physical one of a total devastation of the Korean Peninsula. Cities and villages, and mountains and rivers and everything is totally devastated. But it is the ideological war between freedom and dictatorship and democracy and communism. It is kind of a shown interesting way of a long, delayed negotiation of armistice, because armistice negotiations began just 1 year after the starting of the war in the summer of 1951. But the negotiation lasted 2 years along the line of the military demarcation lines that is similar to 38th parallel. But the major problem was returning the prisoners of wars, because many Chinese POWs are coming from the Kuomintang's nationalist forces after the civil war in China. So these captured soldiers did not want to go to China. They did want to go to Taiwan, where their families and relatives now there. So it is so embarrassing that the communist Chinese leaders that allowing these Chinese POWs, going to Taiwan. So it make matters complicated. Also, the South Korean soldiers captured in the initial stage of Korean War, they just forcibly becoming North Korean soldiers and captured. They also wanted to go to South Korea instead of North Korea. That's how it caused such a long delay of negotiation armistice. Of course, along with the Stalin's intention to prolong the war in the Korean Peninsula, that because Stalin wanted the U.S. still focused on the Korean War during the time that Stalin wanted to strengthen its power in Europe. That's another, causes. Number two aspect of the Korean War is an international war, although starting as a civil war. So for the first time, the war started as a UN resolution. So United Nations Command was formed, and actually Truman did not get the congressional approval for the Korean War. It was by the UN resolution. And on the other side is North Korea, China, and Soviet Union alliances. There are lots of casualties in the United Nations forces, and South Korea, of course, and United States soldiers, a lot of casualties. So 36,914 soldiers dead. And also, I have to make note of that there was a Japanese civilians and soldiers, officers involved in the Korean War that has been kept secret for many, many decades, but it's now known that US bases in Japan, there are many civilians. They came together with the US soldiers in the beginning of the Korean War. And later, some Japanese officers joined the US planning of the war in the Korean Peninsula logistics, the war logistics. Japanese officers probably, knew very well because they occupied the Korean Peninsula. And later, major operation is naval demining, when the General MacArthur, operation of Incheon landing, and later Wonsan operation. So there are Japanese navies, previous officers and soldiers did the operation. So if not thousands, hundreds of Japanese joined. And also, the Chinese involvement in the Korean War is too terrible. A lot of poor, sort of pitiful volunteers. We don't know how many Chinese soldiers died. They're one by one. These are soldiers. They call it the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, but I don't think it's a volunteers at all. But we don't know how many Chinese soldiers dead. Probably more than a million. But the involvement of Chinese soldiers into the Korean War is complicated. There are many interpretations of the debt of blood between North Korea and China, the Chinese Civil War and North Korean Civil War, back and forth, and the strategic consideration by the Chinese communists. Another note I have to make is that the Soviet involvement in the Korean War that has been kept secret, but it's been no secret. Thousands of Soviet air forces joined with the Soviet airplanes, aircraft, camouflaged, disguised as a North Korean flag, and North Korean soldiers, outfit the Soviet Air Force soldiers. They joined a lot of fighting in the middle kind of stage of Korean War. So, all in all, South Korea, US, and Japan on one side, and North Korea, China, and Soviet Union on the other side joined the Korean War, and still going on. Another aspect of the Korean War is nuclear weapons. Truman was considered nuclear attacks, although, in a hesitant manner, when the China got involved in the Korean War in late November. But actually, Truman decided not to. And in later historical archives said that Truman met with the Robert Oppenheimer, who developed nuclear weapons. And when they talk each other, Oppenheimer said to Truman that I got blood on my hands. When Truman said, it is known that I've got more blood on my hands through the nuclear bomb in Japan. So probably that's why Truman decided not to bomb China and both the cities of China, even Beijing, that General MacArthur insisted such bombing of nuclear bombs, so that General MacArthur dismissed by Truman in April 1951. That was an unpopular decision at the time, but Truman fired MacArthur. Another aspect of Soviet Union's nuclear weapons, 1945, it developed. And 1964, China developed nuclear weapons. Prior to that, England and France developed nuclear weapons. And then later in 2017, North Korea developed nuclear weapons. And finally, there was a persistent features of Cold War structures. As I said, in the Korean War, South Korea, China, and North Korea, China, and Russia as now all nuclear armed states, and the South Korea, US, and Japan. So, as I said, North and South Korea is sort of a linchpin of the two wings that we need a peaceful reunification with a cultural, soft power. So the Soviet Union provided lots of armament, as I said. Interestingly, as I talk later, more in the later lectures, North Korea providing a lot of armaments and missiles and rockets to Russia in the current Russia and Ukraine war. So unfortunate. And there is another revisionist leftist view criticizing U.S. imperialism in Korea, said that even famous professor said that Korean War was started by South Korea and the U.S. And that was so, nonsensical. They saying that there's a frequent, skirmishes and border conflicts between 1949 and 1950, and President Seung-ho Lee kind of proclaimed the attack uh, uh, against North Korea, but that is sort of propaganda. But war as actually prepared by Soviet Union and North Korea's Kim Il-sung, it is obvious that at the start of the Korean War on June 25th, 1950, in 3 days, the capital city, Seoul, was captured by North Korean army. What kind of countries prepared a war and attack North Korea and in return retaliate in 3 days? So it's nonsensical to talk about the Korean War was started by the US and the South Korea. Okay, so in conclusion, so division of 30th parallel is caused by rapid spread of communism virus by the Soviet Union. That's my conclusion. And the US, in a hurried manner, stopped the spread of communism by containing the virus at the 30th parallel. That is, I guess, the best what the US could do in a very complicated, at the end of World War II, in ending the war with Japan and disarming process on the Korean Peninsula, although it's unfortunate. And the aftermath of the division is that, as I said, catastrophic international war on the Korean Peninsula, physically and ideologically. And there was another division of the Korean Peninsula. The current division at the military demarcation line, so curved lines, but alongside the 30th parallel, is mainly caused by communist Chinese intervention in the Korean War. And the Korean War, as you know, ended with the armistice. It's just a ceasefire, not a formal peace treaty was signed. And the demarcation lines within the so-called demilitarized zone. The famous DMZ now has been there more than 70 years. So July 27, 1953. It is 4 kilometers by 250 kilometers in the middle of the Korean Peninsula. Still existing, lots of thousands of North Korean artilleries positioning, vowing to attack South Korea and Seoul. So in the next lectures, we're going to talk about the Korean DMZ that has been exist for the last 70 years, and how to turn it into a UN peace zone, United Nations peace zone that includes the Peace Park and the fifth UN office that are measures to maintaining the world peace and permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. But we're going to talk about more about the UN peace zone and US North Korea relations in later lectures. So I hope we can meet again in the next lectures. And thank you very much for listening to this lecture. Thank you.